Welcome to the American Reading Company webinar series. I am Megan Maloney. I'm our Chief Academic Officer, and I'm so pleased to be here this afternoon with all of you, as well as to be hosting Dr. Sonia Cabell. Dr. Cabell is an associate professor at Florida Center for Reading Research, and we're so excited for her to be here today. She will tell you about herself, but why we're excited to have her today is we've all been reading and learning about the science of reading for some time now. And as we've been introduced to Dr. Cabell's work, it's really around language development and building knowledge and how they work together. And that's what I'm so excited to hear about today and be able to make connections with the work that we're doing in the field. So welcome, and I'm going to hand it over to Gina Zorzi-Klein.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gina Zorzi-Klein, Chief Program and People Officer at American Reading Company. I would say that I'm not going to talk long because we want to hear from Dr. Cabell, but Sonia is just, I have been really wowed by her ability to integrate the research and the practicality of what it should be like in actual classrooms, and her focus on language, knowledge, and writing, and how all of those things have to go together from the beginning, not waiting till middle school, but starting in pre-K and K. So I can't wait for you all to hear what she has to say about how we really should do kindergarten. And also congratulations on your recent promotion from assistant to associate professor.
Thank you. What a nice welcome. And I appreciate everyone here and seeing people from different countries and all across the United States as well. Welcome. It's an honor to be here. And I'm excited to talk to you today about how you can support early literacy skills through content-rich English language arts instruction. And that's really the focus of today. We're going to bring together the language piece and the knowledge piece together. And Gina, I love that you talked about the writing piece. We're not going to speak as much about that today, a little bit, but I love that as well. Again, I'm Sonia Cabell from Florida Center for Reading Research at the Florida State University. I started my career as a second grade teacher and a reading specialist and reading coach in kindergarten through third grade settings. In my graduate work, I really got into the prevention of reading difficulties and realized that understanding the very early foundations of children's learning was extremely important in preschool and the early primary grades. And so most of my research focuses there. In the science of reading in the popular media, you hear a lot about phonics instruction or decoding. And while that's important, it's not all there is to the science of reading. And probably I'm preaching to the choir with our current audience here. In addition, some people also think of the early years, kindergarten through second grade, as a time when kids are learning to read. And later on, they read to learn. However, children are reading to learn all along, right from the beginning. They can read, learn from reading right away. In the simple view of reading, reading comprehension is a product of decoding and listening comprehension or language comprehension. Both of these pieces, both the decoding, the fluent, effortless word recognition, as well as language comprehension, understanding what is being read. Both of these are critical. But today, we're going to focus on comprehension and particularly the components that go into language comprehension. You might be familiar also with Scarborough's rope model, and it also implicates language learning and vocabulary, and syntax, inferencing into language comprehension, into the rope that is woven together. let's start by defining and thinking about what are academic language skills. A lot of times people like to refer to academic language skills as the kind of the language, academic language being the language in books and in schools, the language that's privileged in texts, and the formal register of written language. And academic language skills are those skills that enable students to use and understand academic language. Those include things like inferential language skills, which is the ability to talk about things beyond the here and now, beyond the immediate context. Narrative language skills, the ability to relate a series of fiction or nonfiction events, academic vocabulary and syntactical knowledge, really being able to understand the language, the words and the syntax in the grammatical structure of formal writing. And one way that we develop those language skills, or the chief way, right, is through the conversations that we have, right from birth, the conversations that we're having, the back and forth exchanges that we're having with adults build children's language skills. And I want to first focus attention on the importance of conversations to build language. And conversations in classrooms where students are active participants and where teachers are responsive partners can help build children's academic language. A lot of the research around conversations really comes from the preschool setting. And I want to point out, though, there's a lot of talk happening in classrooms, but not all talk is conversation. Okay. A lot of what we know comes from the preschool setting, and some work by Huttenlocher and colleagues is really some important kind of seminal work around language, as how adult language in the classroom relates to children's language. As teachers, the complexity of teachers' talk increases or in the classroom. Children's complexity of what they can understand increases. Huttenlocher and colleagues also showed that this was true of parents as well in language at home. So there's something about the importance of the talk and the language learning environment that children are exposed to. And just because this research has taken place in preschool settings with 4-year-olds does not mean that automatically learning becomes something different when they move into kindergarten, right? The language learning environment, which is often, I think, neglected in the primary grades oftentimes. We often think about it maybe for the younger kids, but not really as we're moving in. That language learning environment is so incredibly important. And one of the reasons why it might be important, this is one potential mechanism, is that children and teachers tend to mirror each other's language. For example, my colleagues and I did a study where we found that children were likely to follow a teacher's complex utterance with one of their own. So for example, if the teacher said something like, "This clock tells us the time and we can move the hands," a child might say in response, "Can I move the hands on the clock and change the time?" And vice versa. This goes the other way. A child might say, "Can I move the hands on the clock and change the time?" And the teacher might say, "Of course you can move the hands on the clock and change the time." So there's this potential mirroring of complexity of utterance that could be one way that children learn from teachers' language. And so overall, when we think about the conversational responsivity literature, this is what this is called, conversational responsivity, this idea of being a conversationally responsive partner with children. It's about maintaining conversations on a particular topic over multiple turns. And what that means is I might say something, you might say something, I might say something again, then you say something. That's a 4-turn conversation. Now, in our work in preschool classrooms, we saw how rare a 4-turn conversation was, and how extremely rare 10 turns on the same topic was, which is a bit shocking. A lot of times what we saw happening was that a child would say something, the teacher would respond, and it would move to a different topic, or a teacher would say something, child would respond, and the teacher would move to a different topic. And these conversations can be with an adult, and multiple children, and then back to the adult. It doesn't have to be with one-on-one conversations. It can be group conversations. And research shows that when teachers elicit student participation in conversations by doing things like asking open-ended questions and extend what students are saying, building on what they're saying, those are related to children's vocabulary growth. So back to the academic language skills, okay? These serve as a bridge between the casual language register we use in speech and the formal language register in books. Not every conversation that we have is going to be equally effective at promoting academic language. For example, some work by Cunningham and Stanovich and Hayes and Ahrens has shown the difference between reading a simple children's book, preschool children's book, has more instances of rare words than us talking to one another as college graduates. Okay. So there's something in the language of books that's different than in our everyday spoken register, right? In the language of texts. In fact, at the end of kindergarten, these are words that children need to be able to read on their own on a third grade standardized reading test, for example. Now, as I look through that list and I think about my everyday conversations with, say, my son who's 6 years old, I don't say a lot of these words. There's some words that I don't use outside of reading aloud, right? So where are children going to learn these words if the books that they're reading themselves don't contain words like this? And the spoken conversations we have don't contain language like this. Well, reading aloud to children right from the beginning is critical to help them learn the language of spoken of text, and the conversations that you have around read alouds are likely to involve different types of words because you're talking about the text itself. And so that's one way K-2 teachers can incorporate conversations in their daily language practice to build academic language, is by having rich text-based discussions in which they're active conversational partners with children, and they encourage children to talk to one another during interactive read alouds. I'm going to stop right there for a moment.
I think Megan has the follow-up question, but so I just wanted to say I was reading to my 4-year-old last night. We're reading Magic School Bus on the ocean floor, and I'm pointing and just reading it, and I'm trying to skip lots of it because it's time for bed. But and I said, oh, there's the continental shelf. There's that. She goes, wait, where's the continental shelf? Where on the diagram is the continental shelf? And then I had to explain the continental slope and the continental shelf. And right.
And right there, what you just said, where on the diagram is the continental shelf? When would we use those words if there wasn't some sort of material that was helping us talk about those words, right? Helping us think about those words and and oftentimes this is facilitated by content.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we think about content, you talked in the beginning, Sonia, about that false dichotomy about learning to read and reading to learn, and where's that switch or where's that transition? Can you talk a little bit more about that and how it impacts what could be happening in some K-2 classrooms?
Right. I think that the learning to read and reading to learn, my colleague James Kim from Harvard said it really nicely, so I'm going to steal something he said, so I want to give him credit. He said that's more about description of development than it is instruction, but it's been taken to be instruction. So even though, developmentally children they're learning to read in the beginning, everybody knows that they're making sense of text and learning to decode, but that reading to learn piece and reading aloud to learn. I think when I think about reading, I think about listening as well, and letting children access texts that are well beyond what they can read on their own, to have exposure to more complex syntactic language as well as vocabulary. So I think that reading to learn piece happens from the very beginning, and I think that there shouldn't be that, we shouldn't think about it as a distinction in instruction.
Well, and I think that kind of ties into the language development, because as the two things I really heard from you the last few minutes is around the need for the read aloud, to have the academic vocabulary, and also the conversation. So making sure that those two things are happening are key in developing them to not only learn to read, but to have that content, to be building that knowledge.
Yes, and that those, when I say conversations during read alouds, it's not necessarily always have to take place in the middle of the read aloud. There's conversations that happen before, during, and after your interactive read aloud. So I'm talking about conversations that encompass all of those things, as well as conversations you might have later on in the day that relate back to the learning that took place. Since reading aloud to children is one way to get that rich knowledge and language of books as well in delivered to children. There's more than one way, but if that is one way, that using that as a springboard makes a lot of sense. All right, so now we're going to talk about building knowledge and during English language arts instruction. I'm going to read this to you. Customarily, 6 to 8 ushers create the arch. The ushers may be commissioned officers from different branches of service and thus in different uniforms. If that many ushers are not needed, other military guests may be asked in advance to assist the ushers in performing the service. I wonder if you know what this means. Now, you might know all of the vocabulary words here, but you still might not know what it means because you don't have the background knowledge. Now, a few months ago, I was in a room full of educators and I read this and I asked them, what do you think it means? And one of them said, it's a funeral. And somebody else said, it's a wedding. Well, you would be right if you thought it was a wedding, okay? And actually, this is my wedding picture from 1998. And the Arch of, if you had the background knowledge to understand that the Arch of Sabers has to do with at the end of a wedding ceremony, then you would have that knowledge. And yes, the Army Wife Handbook really is a book, and I owned one. I was the proud owner of one for many years as a military wife. But this just demonstrates the idea that even if you have the language, the syntactical and even the vocabulary, but you don't have the schema to really understand the context, you don't have all the knowledge that to bring to the table to really understand this. So it's not just language alone, right? It's also background knowledge. Okay. And so that knowledge piece, my colleague Heijin Huang and I recently wrote in a 2020 article in the Reading Research Quarterly. We wrote about how this knowledge piece is often left out of the equation in the science of reading and not really fully discussed. And so this knowledge piece is critical to being able to understand. And again, Scarborough, it was it's always in there in these models, right? Every theoretical model about comprehension incorporates knowledge. And you even see it here in Scarborough's rope. That first thing in the language comprehension that's written down is background knowledge. Now, some people think of vocabulary as just the tip of the iceberg of someone's knowledge. And the idea of the tip of the iceberg is what we can see, the part you can see sticking out, but there's this whole big iceberg underneath where you can't see that contains all the knowledge. So when you think about vocabulary and the knowledge that we have connects, our vocabulary is really connected to each other in a network. Unfortunately, for our primary grade children, research shows that there's just not enough time spent in science and social studies in the primary grades, in all of the elementary grades, but particularly in K2 settings. So how will young children build the kinds of knowledge that they need in order to understand the texts that they're expected to read? And this is there's a distinction between activating knowledge and building knowledge, okay? And even some curricula will say that they're activating knowledge. That they're building knowledge, but it's really activating. And when you're activating knowledge, you are just bringing up knowledge that a child already has to remind them of that knowledge so that they can use it to understand what they're listening aloud or what they're about to read. But how do you activate something that you don't already have? Like, how do I activate knowledge if I don't have it? This is a good link. I think I saw in the chat, someone was asking if you'll get the slides, and yes, you'll get a PDF of the slides and it'll have these links. I really like this link where Dr. Susan Newman talks about this. But so I want to make sure to make the distinction between activating and actively building that knowledge, and how building knowledge is often left out of the discussion on the science of how to teach reading in the primary grades. Now, one solution to this, so traditionally, English language arts instruction and science and social studies instruction have been siloed and have been quite separate from each other. That is, what children are learning in English language arts isn't always connected traditionally to what they learn in science and social studies, if they're having science and social studies at all. But one way that districts in the last decade or so have been approaching this is through integrating science and social studies into the English language arts block. Again, this is one way curriculum developers and districts have been approaching this, right? Some curriculum developers use a more integrated approach between content knowledge and literacy, but a lot of programs are infusing science and social studies into English language arts, into English language arts approach. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So a curriculum that's designed to simultaneously build literacy skills and knowledge can be considered a content-rich English language arts approach. Let's briefly talk about what the research says about whether content-rich English language arts approaches actually improve student learning. Let's start a little bit zoomed out. My colleague, Heijin Huang, at the University of Minnesota, and I conducted a meta-analysis on approaches that integrate literacy and content knowledge. So these are not just content-rich English language arts approaches, but rather approaches that integrate literacy and knowledge, no matter if they're in English language arts or science and social studies in kindergarten through 5th grade settings. This study is in press with Scientific Studies of Reading and will be out soon. We found approximately 35 studies that were experiments or quasi-experiments. Experiments just mean that there was random assignment between a treatment and a control group, and a quasi-experiment means there is a treatment group and a comparison, but they weren't randomly assigned to that condition. Okay. Experiments and quasi-experiments give us some of our best evidence of a causal impact, meaning something causes the other. This curriculum implementation causes this learning. So that's what we looked at in this meta-analysis. And we found that there was a moderate to large effect on vocabulary and comprehension, including a significant effect on standardized comprehension when programs were integrated with literacy and content versus being the traditional instruction. And there was actually quite a large effect on the content knowledge itself. When you zoom into evidence-based kindergarten through 2nd grade content-rich English language approaches, I have a listing here. There's about 7 to 8 studies, and there's some approaches created by researchers that are still being created that are not necessarily publicly available. My colleague Jimmy Kim has created the model of reading engagement with content area literacy instruction by Carol Connor, science ideas by Battalion Romance. There are some available programs though that are either commercially available or free. Freely available, World of Words is an example of a supplemental program in K through 2 settings, project place units, project-based learning. The links are there on Nell Duke's site. Core knowledge language arts, the knowledge strand. which I've studied, and a more recent addition, the ARC Core Kindergarten study just came out very recently. So we weren't able to integrate that into our meta-analysis or our synthesis of these content-rich approaches, but they had very promising findings as well. And in particular, I told you that core knowledge was the one that my group was studying. I'm not a developer of core knowledge. I just found it to be a unique program and that I wanted to study. So we ran two randomized control trials in large urban districts in kindergarten, and we saw that there was an impact on both vocabulary and knowledge, in particular on both proximal measures, which are measures like you learn the words that were taught and you learn the knowledge that was taught. Those are the little bit less exciting ones, the ones you expect to see. But then there was also impact on standardized measures such as vocabulary, as well as science knowledge. And very few studies have found generalized impacts on those types of measures. So I'm going to stop right there again to see if there's questions or discussion that we want to have about that before we move on to more specific strategies.
Sonia, can you share a little bit? I mean, I know you have classroom experience and in second grade. So what would you point out based on what your research is showing you now, that if you were to go back into a second grade classroom, that you might do the same or do something differently from the classroom teacher approach?
That's a really great question. I think that, you know, if I was teaching anywhere from pre-K through second grade, those would be the grades that I would choose. After second grade, I leave it to other people after that. But I think I definitely would want to be using something that really puts content and particularly science, I would say. In some of my work, I found that the science context in particular seems to be a facilitative context for richer language use from teachers. And I also find it to be something that children are very naturally curious about and interested in understanding the world around them. However, I would want there to be strong both social studies and science, and then integrate literacy into those, make it more integrative rather than the literacy being jumping from topic to topic, which is usually done. Definitely when I was a teacher, I was a teacher in the early 2000s. So I'm dating myself here and giving away my age. But I was a teacher 20 years ago. And I think that some of the, programs still do similar, although those programs have improved in general and there's more to choose from. There are the traditional kind of basal type of approaches still do a similar thing of keeping the science and social, jumping around from topic to topic. Recently, I did a review of the Wonders curriculum with the student achievement partners, and I talk about that in terms of Wonders being a series where, yes, there is knowledge partially built in, but it hops from topic to topic. And what that does is it really privileges the kids who already have that background knowledge, rather than trying to build that knowledge for all children.
Can you talk just like that is such an important point, because everyone says they do topics now, but your push on the difference between deep topic study and loose thematic connections is so important.
Yeah, that might actually be a good segue into the next section, because I have a couple slides.
Good, let's do that.
Okay. So let's get back into it. Let's talk about what are those evidence-based practices that effective content-rich English language arts approaches have in common. And again, these are the K2 ones that we talked about. Again, I showed you that we weren't able to look at the ARC Core study hadn't come out, so ARC Core is not included in this synthesis here. The features of, so these include planning units around science and social studies topics, using conceptually coherent text sets ordered to build content knowledge, discussion and writing focused on building knowledge, and teaching relationships among the words. These seem to be the commonalities that we were seeing. There was a lot of variation though in these studies, but these seem to be the common threads. Now, typical English language arts instruction often focuses on themes instead of topics. And so I like to, I use those words differently. I use the word theme for things like, what can we try when we learn new things? Or what can animals teach us? Or all about me, or those are kind of common themes, you know, that you might see in a reading program. The content, you know, content is often embedded, but it's often jumping from topic to topic and relying on children's, activating children's existing background knowledge. So they're going to have to learn it some other place, but not in that program. They're going to have to come to the table with it. So here's an example from Wonders, actually. I'm not necessarily, I don't think Wonders is a bad program. Actually, a lot of the Basel series that I reviewed, I really like Wonders. However, if we're thinking about content and content teaching and integrating content teaching, this is the kind of weekly structure that one unit has. For example, what can animals teach us? What are some messages in animal stories is week 1's essential question. Week 2 is, how do animal characters change familiar stories? Week 3 was, how are all living things connected? And week 4, how are writers inspired by animals? Those don't cohere into coherent science or social. You would think that this would be like a science unit about animals if you were looking from the lens of purely content-rich approaches, which seem to be driven by content. So that's a difference there. In addition, typical English language arts instruction often inconsistently are coherent text sets. I think there's some attempt to make additional coherent text sets, but it's not consistent. And discussion and writing don't consistently have the intent of building knowledge. And then their relationships among words are not taught explicitly, I think largely because word selection, because it starts with the kind of the coherent text selection. If those texts aren't selected for a particular topic, then you can't select words that would then cohere really well, right? Because you're pulling those from the texts. So those typical English language arts instruction doesn't have have those pieces merged. But let's talk now about features of content-rich English language arts instruction. The first is the planning units around science and social studies topics like farms, Native Americans, Arctic animals, animal habitats. And so there is a distinct difference here. The content is taught in a logical structure or sequence with approximately 2 to 4 weeks focus on a given topic, at least in the studies that are currently out there. And then in terms of building coherent text sets ordered to build content knowledge, you might see something like a set of books where each book builds a little bit. So here is a set where you learn about growing vegetable soup has to do with understanding about seeds and living things, and then you can build in a text that is informational. So that first one's informational narrative. You can build it in informational text. The third one, how a seed grows, and then the Great K-pop Tree narrative. So it doesn't mean a coherent text set doesn't mean it's only informational text ever. It can be narrative, informational narrative, informational. It can be a variety of these things. There's often primary source materials that are used in social studies as well, such as diaries or artifacts, interviews, letters, documents like the Bill of Rights, for example. And in these programs as well, there is this feature of an interactive read aloud, where children are having conversations with each other and with adults that help language development before, during, and after the read aloud. And just like we were saying earlier, the texts are more syntactically complex than what students can read on their own. thus exposing them to richer language. In addition, you know, with the advent of the Common Core State Standards, more informational text was, you know, recommended very early on. And as you use informational text, it appears to influence the types of questions teachers pose. In one study by Zucker and colleagues, they found that informational text teachers posed more inferential types of questions. And then coherent, like we said just a moment ago, they also span many genres. A third feature is discussion and writing focused on building knowledge. So engaging students in discussion by connecting their prior learning to new learning, eliciting students' contributions by asking open-ended questions and extending what they're saying. If asking an inferential question tends to elicit an inferential language from children. And discussion after the book reading is related to expressive vocabulary gains in one study. So this idea of using that conversational responsivity literature and that largely comes from the preschool setting to really help strengthen discussion and why and when you might be, what kinds of strategies using during discussion, I think is a rich avenue for further exploration. And then another feature that these kinds of programs had in common were that they engaged students in writing in meaningful ways with the purpose of building knowledge. So opportunities, for example, in a study by Kim and colleagues, they looked at first grade students wrote an argumentative piece, "Could you survive in the Arctic?" And they used this strategy that has typically been used with older children, it's called the tree strategy, but showed that it could effectively be used with first graders. The topic sentence, reasons for their opinion, examining each reason from the audience's perspective, and then having an ending. And finally, teaching relationships among words. I love the image of a spider web when I think about relationships among words. So if you think about a web, if it's a web is tight, things don't fly through it, they get stuck on it. But if a web is loose, things fly right through. So if I have knowledge about a particular topic, let's say it is the word atmosphere, and I know a lot of things about atmosphere, and let's say I'm I work at NASA. So let's say I've learned about a lot about the atmosphere as well. I would have a very rich web. But if I don't know that much about the atmosphere and have just a few words that I can kind of connect to atmosphere, my web is going to be much looser than like that NASA scientist who really understands about atmosphere, right? In the same way, our words and ideas are connected to one another around concepts. So we have a web of ideas and words in these concepts. So if students have a wider breadth of knowledge and vocabulary, they can build wider and stronger networks of information to draw on when they listen to or read a new text. And then explicitly teaching relationships among words also includes, parts of, for example, this is when you teach about plants, you're teaching also about the parts. So not just the whole, the parts. And here's an example from the textproject.org, which has many good resources about teaching not only content specific words, but also general purpose words. So in all of these programs, I'll point out too, they didn't just teach content specific words. They also had general purpose words that were useful to students to learn, those which some might consider high mileage types of words, those some might consider tier 2 types of words. Here's another example of a concept of definition map. This is for the magnetism. That was taken from a paper that I think that that is going to be dropped in the chat that has open access that you can link to, that kind of explains some of these strategies. And there are many ways that words can be related. So for example, thematically related words are involved in the same event, like rain and umbrella, or car and garage, and they're spatially related. They don't share inherent characteristics, but they're thematic. Worms, garden, rake, we know that they come from the same sort of theme. Categorically related words are things of the same type or category. So hammer, chisel, and screwdriver. Synonyms, right? Antonyms, opposites. Things that are part to whole. Toes and feet, tuba and orchestra. So there's many ways words are related in our minds. Now, some important caveats I want to make is that in a lot of these studies we looked at, both in the comprehensive larger meta-analysis that where we looked at integrated programs in K through 5 settings, as well as the K2 content-rich approaches. Some of the programs had comprehension strategies that are integrated into effective approaches. I think of it as a both and. I don't necessarily think that comprehension strategies should not be used. I think that there's some very good evidence of comprehension strategies in our literature. So I think of it as building knowledge and the use of comprehension strategy. So I just want to say that in promoting content knowledge, I'm not saying that comprehension strategies haven't also been useful. I think they've been overused and overemphasized, but there is good research based on the use of those. And the general purpose words, like I said earlier, tier 2 vocabulary, they're still important to teach alongside content vocabulary. So don't misconstrue what I'm saying to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, and we'll never teach those general purpose words and only content specific words, because these kinds of programs also included those. Some programs integrate decoding and knowledge, not just language and knowledge. But not all of the programs. So there were some instances of decoding and knowledge also being more integrated. And if a program doesn't integrate these features, integrate content and language, it doesn't mean it's a bad program. It just means it's not a content-rich program. So the question is, what are you trying to get out of your program? You know, what are you looking for? And I would recommend considering content area instruction and English language arts instruction throughout the day, and think about how your English language arts instruction connects with your expectations for science and social studies learning. Are those completely disconnected, or are they integrated? Do your K2 kids have access to science and social studies learning? And if you find your curriculum, you know, is wanting, how might you supplement your existing curricula? Teachers also, regardless of what a curriculum you're using, teachers need professional support to effectively integrate literacy and content teaching. This is a difficult thing. And I think one hesitation of teachers that, in my experience, has been around, I don't know enough about the content to teach it well. And so I think teachers need to be supported and provided with professional development and support, ongoing supports, to ensure that they can be confident that they can be a good teacher of both reading and content areas simultaneously. Because I think that there's something about the integration of these that is powerful. And I think we are seeing that with the results of our meta-analysis. Something about integrating content-rich English language content and literacy. One of the avenues that I think might be one of the reasons that I alluded to earlier that I'd like to think about in my own research moving forward is this idea of content being a facilitative mechanism for richer language, a richer language learning environment for children. Some of my work has to do with that, and I'd like to continue to press on that further to see if that bears out in research. There's many resources, like I said, I have linked in these handouts that you'll get, including podcast episodes. The first is an open access journal article, the Florida Center for Reading Research, reading research quarterly articles. If you are not able to access them, just send me an email. Some other resources that I mentioned. Please do follow me at Twitter, and here's my contact information. And thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. We did get some questions from the chat, and the one that I'd want to elevate, since you mentioned looking for these types of curriculum, can you recommend a rubric or a checklist that you've seen that hits on the content-rich part and the building knowledge?
You know, that's a very good question, and I have not seen the rubric for that. In fact, I think people have different ideas about what they're looking for. For example, let's take the Wonders report that I was alluding to. So Ed Reports, which rates the quality of areas, was using a rubric internally. I don't know their rubric, but by what they are rating. Wonders, for example, rated high quality and knowledge building as much as any of the knowledge building curricula, the ones that I would consider more knowledge building curricula, like ArtCore and Core Knowledge and expeditionary learning, and like the Wit and Wisdom. Like, so there was no distinction, it seemed like, between those. But when so I took a different lens on Wonders, for example, than Ed Reports did when looking at that. So I think that you really have to look at the rubrics that you have access to see if it's really what you want to be looking at. So again, I think it's a different set of criteria. So no, I don't have one that I know of, but I would love if someone in this call did know of one. I'd be really love to see it.
Well, and I think it's important because I think many times they're looking at curriculum from the K-5 lens and not breaking it down to K2 or 3-5. Do you have any feedback on that?
There's such a difference, I think, between the primary grades and the upper elementary grades, that I do think you're looking for different things. I think that in the primary grades, there's the decoding aspects, and what are you going to do with the decoding pieces, and to what extent do you want those integrated in with your content, building. Like, so for example, ArtCore does integrate those features, whereas a program like Core Knowledge Language Arts from K through 2 has those features separated into kind of a decoupleable curriculum. So it just depends on what you are looking for. But yes, I do think that it shouldn't just be lumped. K is very different than 5. I'm sorry. K is really different than 2.
I see another question that's making me think about this too, about the question about content text that is not developmentally appropriate for children, which of course is true in science and social studies,
Right.
But wow, another great argument for science.
I think that's it's a very interesting question, and I know that that's somewhat of that's a hot topic. I don't necessarily talk about or advocate whose content to teach or what content to teach. I have ideas as a parent of what content I want my child being exposed to or not exposed to, but I personally don't necessarily, from a research perspective, have I don't necessarily really talk about that issue because I think it's politically charged, and I think that there's value judgment that's placed on it that research alone is not going to be able to just answer that question on is it developmentally appropriate for my content for my child, because what I think about the one set of content might be really different about what somebody else might think about that same content. So in my researching programs, I'm not necessarily advocating for the content or the scope and sequence of the content of a particular program. I know that's a very non-satisfying answer, so I apologize. Okay, so I like the comment too about, yes, to be fair, Ed Report, yes, it lays out a process that encourages communities to define their priorities. So I don't know intimately the Ed Report's process. Okay, so I'm not trying to make a comment on ed reports. My comment is strictly about the lack of distinction in the ed reports ratings on a curriculum, a basal core, a reading program curriculum like Wonders versus ones that are intentionally trying to build knowledge more deeply. I know ed reports does very good work.
It helped really identify what high quality curriculum is
Mhm.
and helps identify those different areas of reading and what it needs to include, especially to make sure that we're including things for all students and English language learners.
And I would say that, at least from my perspective, ed reports seem to make it like popular, put it on the map, that these things, including knowledge building, was a really important consideration. To my knowledge, that's how I learned about ed reports, is because they kind of made it like raise the visibility of the importance of all of those features.
I really think they transformed the conversation in deep ways, and that every curriculum you're mentioning here, Sonia, is a quality curriculum and the right curriculum for some districts and some
Right.
communities. And just like, of course, as one of the authors of Our Core, I think Our Core is a fantastic curriculum. It's not necessarily the perfect curriculum for every community. And we would be a weaker nation if we did not have a diversity of curricula.
Yeah, I agree. Just like I was saying earlier, my son school last year used Wonders, and there was lots of things I really liked in kindergarten. There's lots of things I really liked about Wonders. My commentary on Wonders is whether it builds knowledge. So I think that different communities are going to choose different things. The question becomes, if you're interested in integrating your content and your literacy instruction, even no matter what curriculum you're using, there are ways to supplement that curriculum to help meet that needs. And then there's curricula that are expressly designed to do that, either in the English language arts space or more generally. So I think it's going to depend on the priorities for a district as to what they're interested in.
So where do we need to go next with this research and other research you're looking at? How do we put this into practice, and where do we go?
So I really think that content-rich English language arts approaches burst onto the scene because we silo all of our subjects. So we silo English language arts, and there's a textbook adoption cycle for English language arts that is not the same as science or social studies. There's not the incentive for programs that cut across the day. For example, in preschool, you have the preschool programs that involve your whole day, right? But once you get into kindergarten, it's separated out into subjects. So I think that having more integrated approaches really makes a lot of sense, so that learning is fully integrated for children. And I know that you are have a program that is, I'm still learning about Art Core, but from what I see of it, it's trying to do that integration and meet both content standards and English language arts standards. I know that Nell Duke is creating a program right now called Great First Eight that is trying to do an integrative across the day approach. So I personally think that's the future direction we should be heading, to have coherence for our children, where their English language arts program isn't wholly different than what they're doing in science or social studies, for example, or they don't have to continue to switch gears between things. So yeah, that's what I think is, and the other thing as Gina mentioned earlier in the call, another area of research for me is writing and early writing. I think it's a huge missed opportunity, especially in the pre-K, K. I think that people think that kids can't write because they are not spelling conventionally yet. However, there is a whole lot of learning that can take place when children are actively trying to write. And there is a lot of reading learning that takes place. Writing and reading are almost two sides of the same coin. As Linnea Airy once put it, one of my kind of influences, researcher heroes. So I think that there's huge missed opportunities there. So I think a program that integrates writing deeply is important.
Well, when you're ready to do your next research study, we have a few projects we'd love to introduce you to that are integrating the language development, the knowledge building, and the writing, and the foundational skills. So we didn't talk much about that, but I think when you think about the integrated approach, ArtCore is doing that. And we put the IES study around ArtCore in the chat box too, and are really looking forward to additional results that we can see in our schools with that integrated approach, and to really do away with those silos. Well, thank you for joining us today. We so appreciate your time and getting to talk with you and learn from you. And all of our participants today, thank you for joining, and we will be in touch. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.